This is a story of a 12-seat dining table I made for my friends Justin and Brittany. It started as a bunch of really rough Cypress. It's about 8/4 and 10 to 11 feet long. So the first step was to mill it. I recently made friends with the awesome guys at Urban Timber Harvest, which is a commercial wood shop here in North Texas where I live. So the first step is to face joint and edge joint each of these boards. They were completely rough, so it took quite a bit of time. I made sure to do a pass on the joiner and let it sit for a couple days and then mill it one more time, make sure it stayed flat. This is a look at their shop. They have an awesome facility. So it is time for the glue up. You might have noticed no shots of the planer here. Ultimately, I decided that these boards were so rough, had quite a bit of twist and cup in a lot of ways. Rather than spending a few hours planing each board to a uniform thickness, I decided to get the bottom of the table completely flat, which is the side that I jointed, go ahead and glue it up, and then move it to their slab miser, which is basically a manual CNC is kind of how I could explain it best, and use that to ultimately get a parallel side on the opposing side to what I jointed. So you can see me and my friend Zach moving in here. That was my friend Ricky helping me glue it up. I was thankful to have a lot of help on this project. It was pretty heavy at this point. It was heavy throughout the entire project, but at this point especially, when it's completely rough, it was quite heavy. So basically the slab miser is a router, essentially a giant spindle with a 5-inch cutter head, and you can kind of mow the lawn of the tabletop. It's probably the incorrect way to explain it, but it's a manually run spindle, and you can use it to flatten mainly live edge slabs, but in this case here, tabletops. We were taking about a 1/16 of an inch off with each pass. So it took quite a few passes, but ultimately I think it was definitely a lot quicker than planing each board to a uniform thickness. That would have taken many hours. You can see it leaves a pretty good finish. So not only does it save a lot of time planing, but it also probably saves a good chunk of time sanding. So now I'm back in my shop, and I am using my new Festool track saw to trim the edges flush. And ultimately I'm going to reinforce these edges here a little bit, so I'm not too worried about making sure it's perfectly square at this point. After we used the slab miser to flatten it, we ended up losing more thickness than I was comfortable with. A lot of those boards started 8/4 and above, and when we were done they were really closer to 6/4, and I really wanted it to be at least 2 inches thick. So here I'm just taking my combination square and marking a uniform line around all 4 edges, and ultimately I will secure some more Cypress to this to kind of give a false added thickness. This ended up working really well because the table weighed so much before we did this. This was a great way to add some structural support, but also take some of the weight off. By the way, I'm using Titebond 3 for all of this, which you definitely want to do if you're building an outdoor table. I know I've heard people say that you can get by with using Titebond Original or Titebond 2, but really go with 3. It's totally waterproof, and it's worth it. That's what the glue up looked like. So I want to jump ship here. The other side of this build was this Lazy Susan that I built for them, which I'm pretty proud of how this one turned out. So here I am using the planer at Urban Timber Harvest's shop, and I'm milling some more cypress. This planer was awesome, left a really good finish. So I face jointed and edge jointed and planed the opposing sides. So here I'm just ripping to a uniform width on my table saw just to get ready for one more glue up. This was a lot smaller than the other one, obviously, so didn't go too bad. Because these boards were pretty thick at this point, didn't feel the need to reinforce them with anything, but I did make sure to clamp from both sides just to make sure that it had even clamping pressure across the top and the bottom. This will ultimately be cut into a circle, so I'm just trying to orient any knots or defects to what will end up residing outside of the circle. So I let this sit for about 24 hours and glue up went just fine. So here I'm coming back with a scraper, a smoothing plane, and a chisel, I believe, just to kind of even the seams, get rid of any glue squeeze out. Made sure to wipe that down before it had totally set up. So it wasn't too bad. Just trying to get a decent finish before it's time to carve. So I sanded this from 80 grit all the way to 220. Here I'm just doing a little water pop to raise the grain a little bit and do one final pass with 320 grit before it was time to stain. So Justin and Brittany really kind of wanted a walnut table, but of course walnut comes at a price. They wanted it to match a beam they had in their backyard, this one right here. And kind of the solution we came up with was going with Cypress and doing a walnut stain, which originally I was not super pumped about, but I'm pretty happy with how the finish came out. It looks pretty good. It's time to carve. So first I'm using a 60-degree V-bit to do all of the detail carving. And then I'll come back with a 1/8" upcut straight bit to cut the circle out. And I'm just gonna cut about halfway through the circle so I don't have to worry about carving into my spoil board or anything. And then I will come back with the bandsaw and cut the majority of that waste away. And then finally come back with a flush trim bit in my router table to get all the way down to the original circle. After that was done, I added a heavy roundover to the top and the bottom. I think this is a 1/4 inch roundover. That looked pretty good. Did require quite a bit of hand sanding, but I was happy with how that came out. And boy, do I need to add some dust collection to this router table. So time to cut all of these edges completely flush and square with each other. This thing was super heavy at this point. Flipping by myself was not fun, but had to be done. So I'm just taking my time here to make sure it's totally square. This first edge is going to kind of dictate all 4 of the edges because I'll use this to reference the next cuts. I'm making this in 2 passes just to make sure to get a clean cut. And yeah, here is the boss checking on the work. She loves to be out in the garage. I gotta say that I just recently picked up this track saw and my Festool ETS random orbital sander, and I gotta say I was really hoping that I wouldn't be that impressed, so that I wouldn't have to spend the money on a Festool ever again. But man, they are worth every penny, and I'm totally addicted now, which is terrifying, but they you get what you pay for. It is worth every penny. I'm doing the edge profile here. I did a 1/8 inch roundover on the top and a 1/4 inch chamfer on the bottom. I was pretty happy with how that came out. It did, again, require quite a bit of hand sanding when it came time for sanding, but it was worth it. Left a pretty modern touch. I was pretty happy with that. So here I am securing some extra Cypress on the bottom. This is what the steel legs will ultimately be attached with. And you'll never see these screws, but I wanted to go ahead and make sure they were placed evenly and wouldn't interfere with the threaded inserts that will hold down the legs. I made sure these were totally countersunk so that they wouldn't interfere with the legs once those go on later on. So I'll spare you quite a bit of it, but it was about 2 full days of sanding. I went all the way from 60 grit all the way up to, I believe, 320 grit. Here's a look at the edge profile. Turned out pretty well. So this was the moment that I was a little nervous about. The Cypress was looking pretty good at this point, so I felt weird putting stain on it, but I am happy with how it turned out. I did go intentionally darker than the beam picture that they sent me. It's just the beginning of summer here in North Texas, so this thing is about to sit out in the 100-degree heat for 2 or 3 months, so it's probably going to lighten up quite a bit. So I intentionally went a little bit darker, knowing that it will probably lighten up quite a bit its first season outside. So for the finish, I tried General Finishes Exterior 450 for the first time. in a semi-gloss. And I was pretty happy with how this came out. They recommend 2 to 3 coats. I ended up doing 3 coats on the bottom and actually 4 coats on the top, just to make sure that it had all the protection it could. I was pretty happy with how this turned out. I would spray it on with my Wagner sprayer and then sand in between coats with 320 grit. And then just make sure to wipe off all of the excess dust, anything that the dust extractor didn't get, or shop vac in my case. So here's after the first or second coat, I believe, and a look after the final coat. I was pretty happy with how it came out. I will definitely be using it again. So just some finishing touches, putting on the Lazy Susan hardware and ultimately the threaded inserts for the steel legs. I was really thankful to have my dad help me. Also my neighbor Steve. This thing was heavy and hard to manage in a 2-car garage, but it got done. And I'm happy with how it came out. So here was the big reveal. First time seeing it all together.
Table. All you need now is 12 disciples. That's what Steve said.
Hey, thanks for watching. Appreciate it.